This is Meet the Candidates on Brattleboro Community Television. I'm your host, Chris Lenois, and today we are speaking with Windham County Senator Becca Balint, a Democrat seeking re-election on November 8th. Welcome, Becca.
Thank you, Chris.
So one term in the books for you.
I know, hard to believe.
Yeah. And again, a contested race.
Yes.
With different people running for the 2 seats available here in Windham County. A little bit different pitch to voters this time around. When you can look back on the track record of what you've done in the last couple of years, share with us a little bit about what you're telling voters.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel really proud of my record. I feel like I went in with a very strong sense of keeping in mind the economic struggles that we have here in Windham County. And having served on Senate Economic Development, I felt like I had a great platform through which to really advocate for voters down here. So a couple of the things that I know people will care about. So I'll start with the businesses downtown. I know for a long time, businesses here in Windham County have felt at a disadvantage to businesses across the border in New Hampshire because of the tax difference, retail tax difference between the 2 states. And we haven't really done a tax study in a long time that looks at how that impacts retailers here in Bellows Falls and the other border towns. And so as part of a tax study that the Joint Fiscal Office is going to be doing, I made sure, along with a couple of members of my committee, that part of that tax study would include a look at the retail sales tax and how it impacts the border towns. So I know there were businesses that really want to know. Let's not talk anecdotally. Let's look at some hard numbers and how we might be able to support businesses going forward. The other thing I really felt strongly about was making sure that we're closing the gap. We do a great job graduating high school seniors here in Vermont. Look, nationally, we're among the top. What we don't do such a great job at doing is making sure those high school students go on for more training. So if you look 36 months out after graduation, a lot of our seniors are not going on to get any kind of additional training. We know we have jobs in Vermont, we know we have jobs in Windham County, but there's a mismatch of skills. So one of the ways in which we can make sure that there's training available for those students that is more affordable is by making sure that Vermont Technical and our other state schools have labs that are upgraded, that really can compete with not only with the institutions at surrounding states, but also will let parents know for those students, you really can send your child here in Vermont, get the training they need, and they will be employable long-term in the county. So that I was able to get done through the other committee that I sit on, which is Senate Institutions. And so we had a plan for additional funding for Vermont Technical, and then in the second year of the biennium, we also gave more support to Castleton University. So UVM is our flagship, but we want to make sure folks who are looking for an education that might be more doable, more affordable, are getting top-notch training. So I feel really good about those 2 things. There are others I can talk about, but you know me, I'll just keep going.
They might be on my list here, indeed. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up the sales tax issue, because that is something that I wanted to ask you about in regards to the 2 gubernatorial candidates. Sue Minter, the Democratic candidate, who I know you're supporting,
I am.
Is somebody who has in previous conversations brought up the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission recommendations of 2011, including taxing services here in Vermont.
Right.
Your feelings on that, is that something you'd support?
Well, I might, and here's why. And you can read the report online. I've read it. I encourage everybody to read it so that you understand that the reason why both the House Finance Committee and the Senate Finance Committee have considered what this might look like going forward is because we are not as much of a retail-based economy as we used to be. So you can look at the 2 charts and see that we are simply not drawing the kind of tax base that we used to through retail sales. We still have high needs. We still have populations that need support. And so how do you spread that burden across the constituents more fairly? And so do I believe we have to go definitely towards a service-based tax approach? Not necessarily, but there may be some places there where we should consider it. So I think that my approach to any sort of tax question should be, everything should be on the table. Put it on the table, bring people into committee. That's the way the process works at the legislature. Get people in to testify on why one makes more sense than another. And, I understand the Republican Governors Association, I understand they have a job to do, right? They're trying to get Phil Scott elected governor. I do feel like their most recent ad with Sue Minter as a bobblehead who's just saying yes to all these increased taxes to haircuts and whatnot. You've got a few minutes to try to get your point across. But the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission was bipartisan. That was not an idea that came out of a Democratic focus group. That was a bipartisan group that looked at how can we make taxes more broad-based and make sense in Vermont.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and from Phil Scott's perspective, something he's talked about with regards to revenues is tying budget growth to the growth
Sure.
of the economy here in Vermont.
Yeah.
He hasn't gotten specific yet
Yeah.
on what that means and what that would look like.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you were to look at programs that he's proposing to cut in order to make sure that that ratio stays in line, are there specific programs that you would say, absolutely not, this is a non-starter for me?
Well, I think given the crisis that we're having around opioids, the crisis that we're having around healthcare, I do not feel that we should have any cuts right now to those areas of government. I get calls. Let's bring it back to the local level. I have gotten so many calls this election cycle about how the opioid problem is impacting families, it's impacting schools, it's impacting law enforcement, and so many of us want to feel like it's affecting other people. It's not. Here in Windham County, it is touching pretty much every sector of the economy in ways that we're just beginning to understand. And so we cannot stick our heads in the sand and say, this is only impacting a few people. We have it under control. All you have to do is talk to the schools, talk to law enforcement, talk to people who are trying to hire workforce here in Windham County. We need to have all hands on deck, and I think we need to be honest. And that was actually, I think, one of the most shining moments that Governor Shumlin had, was having his State of the Union addressing an issue that other governors knew was happening, not just in the Northeast, but nationwide, and said, no, let's be honest about what we're facing. So I know that it is not something sexy to talk about, and it is something that is very difficult to get our hands around because it's multifaceted in terms of the levels of supports that families need. But that, for me, is something we need to be constantly keeping our eye on the ball.
Yeah, well, since you brought up healthcare and the fact that
Yeah.
Governor Shumlin has put the opioid addiction problem here
Yeah.
in Vermont in the context of
Right.
care, let's talk a little bit about where healthcare is going to go.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a new leadership at all different levels of government starting in 2017.
Exactly. It's going to be interesting to see what it looks like.
Right, but Governor Shumlin proposing before he leaves this all-payer model,
Yeah.
working this out with the federal government, and he was in Brattleboro not too long ago. I don't know if you were able to attend
I
that.
did. I did
What your
attend.
thoughts are on it?
Yeah, it's been interesting. So I want to thank the governor's office because the delegation here in Windham County felt like we really needed a public forum here in Brattleboro, and there hadn't been one on the schedule, and they were able to accommodate us. And we had a huge turnout. It was at the retreat conference room. And since that day, I've had a number of doctor's appointments, which you know about. And so I was in to see a doctor the other day, and she said, before we get started, can we talk about the all-payer model? So this is
Occupational hazard for
exactly,
you.
and it's great because who better to talk to, right? So in the room, we had a lot of patients who were concerned about how it would impact their level of care, of course. You had providers, you had insurance companies that are wanting to understand how it's going to impact the payment system in hospitals. But to have a doctor in the room saying, can I have a few minutes of your time? This is what I'm concerned about. And so she shared with me some of the concerns that I've heard across the board when I talk to doctors in our county, which is they just need to see more details, right? So this is a bold, broad initiative to really look at how healthcare is paid for. So instead of a fee for service, so you go in, you have a broken arm, they set your arm, you get a breakout of the bill based on what they actually did to you and your arm while you were there, both at the specialist or in the hospital. And it is simply for these discrete expenses. And what the all-payer model is saying is, why aren't we looking at outcome? We should be paying doctors, hospitals, based on how successful they are at keeping people healthy. Now, of course, on paper, that makes perfect sense. That's what we all should be doing, is looking at outcome. What's difficult, I think, for those of us in Windham County as we look at the all-payer model, and I heard these concerns in the forum, which is we have an aging population here. We have in terms of, if you look at our population compared to Chittenden County, we have higher levels of poverty. So you have a high need population in terms of medical care. And so what happens when the money runs out?
Yeah, well,
right?
It's the same thing driving up costs in the current health exchange.
Exactly. And so certainly it appeals to me to be trying something new, because what we're doing, I think I heard this morning, the fear is that the rates of insurance for those on Obamacare are going to go up in the next year.
Average of 25%.
Exactly.
That story came out this morning.
Right, and there'll be subsidies available for the folks who can't afford, but the trajectory continues to be upward. So we know that what we're doing is not containing costs. So it is attractive to me, like the doctors that I talk to. I need to see more details, and I think what's tough too is that you've got a decision being made by the Green Mountain Care Board, and I understand they don't want to put their work on hold because we have a new administration coming in, whether it's Sue Minter or whether it's Phil Scott. They feel like we need to continue to do this work that we've been charged to do.
Yeah. Well, if it's Phil Scott coming in, he's already said he's interested in changing the model, maybe partnering with other states or moving to the federal exchange. Even Sue Minter has said that's on the table for her. Is that something that you think is an option for Vermont, to move to the federal exchange?
I have heard, and again, I know this is not as much in my wheelhouse as some other things, but what I've heard is potentially it could cost Vermont more if at this point we move to the federal exchange. So of course that concerns me, and I don't want people to lose their health care. What does concern me is that I'm continuing to hear from constituents about Vermont Health Connect and their inability to get status changes, and that worries me. And so at what point do you say, whether it costs more money or not, we need to do something different? And so I'm very curious to see with either administration, who they bring in to do that analysis, because that's the important piece. Like, who's going to do that analysis, and how is we in the legislature, how much are we going to be involved in seeing the data? Because I'm getting really tired of hearing from constituents, and I don't mean tired in the sense of it's annoying, just it's defeating. It's discouraging, and I mean, you and I have some of the same people in our social network, and so I'm sure you're hearing some of the same stories, and it's disturbing. But another thing that I want to talk about in terms of healthcare that I am excited about is that I was one of the legislators who really advocated, again, for getting a study through the Joint Fiscal Office to determine, could we expand Dr. Dinosaur up through age 26? Because we know that there's this very scary time for a lot of families. Kids are out of school, they're not covered on insurance anymore. I know I went for years without insurance, and as an asthmatic, that was a little touch and go at times, So it's appealing to me to say to families, if we expanded Dr. Dinosaur up through age 26, then you don't have to be so concerned about your kids who you want to make sure they're covered. And so we'll get those numbers back, I think, in January, and we'll know more if we can move forward on that. So, but we're continuing to work on it.
All right.
Because we have to.
Well, and another thing that you work on a lot is economic development, because that's the committee you serve on in the Senate. It strikes me that a lot of the things that have been done around economic development, well, I mean, there's a micro and a macro aspect to this, right?
Absolutely.
And you think about the micro aspect to it: minimum wage increase, paid sick leave, funding for workforce training.
Right.
Is it time to check the box on those individual worker issues, or do you think there's still more that can be done on that level, that micro level?
That's a great question. I think, as a Democrat, I will always believe that a healthy, supported workforce is going to be good for employers, for families, for schools. And so, of course, we're always looking for the sweet spot. What can we afford, as a small state? I certainly am very curious about how we can be more supportive around childcare issues as it relates to employment. So I'm actually going to be moderating a panel coming up on the 15th called Making It Work in Windham County. And it's going to be great because it's going to be employees, it's going to be employers, it's going to be childcare providers getting in the room and saying, this is another aspect of economic development that we often don't think about. But if you've got people staying out of the workforce, when we desperately need people in the workforce, right? Throughout Vermont, Windham County, we need people in the workforce. If people are staying out, not because they don't want to be in the workforce, but because they simply cannot afford the childcare, then we need to get creative with employers, with some kind of state funding perhaps, about figuring out how do we get these people in the workforce because we need them and they want to be there. So that's something that is both a micro issue in terms of families, but macro in terms of seeing all the parts of the economy that I think in the past we've been so focused on perhaps job creation, right? Or bringing more companies here or expanding the companies here. And that's always one part of it. But I do think that there are some other things that we lose sight of, like housing. That's the other one. We have a shortage of housing statewide. We have a shortage of workers. We can't bring the workers in that we need to do the job because of a lack of housing. And I worked for a long time on a pilot project with a representative from Addison County who was great because he's Republican, Addison County, so different parts of the state. We are at different points in our careers, let's say, and different political philosophies, but we both saw the same thing, which was that, wow, we have a housing crisis and it's impacting our economy. So Representative Fred Baser and I worked on trying desperately to get a pilot started. And we met with the Treasurer's Office. Beth Pierce was great, and we figured out how we might be able to do it. And it was a program to take the infrastructure costs off of new builds, because young families cannot afford, generally, with again, another issue connected, which is debt from college debt, and you need to factor in the down payment, the down payment that you need and the closing costs and all of those things. And so we were just going to do a small pilot to see if this might be a way moving forward. As I learned the hard way, things get cut sometimes the last few days of the biennium, and that's what happened. They just couldn't find the money in appropriations to make it go forward. But I know Fred and I are going to be, if he's reelected and I'm reelected, I know that we both have a lot of energy for it, because I hear at all income levels, the housing crisis is impacting not just families, which is huge, but also our school system. If we don't have places for people to move, we're going to continue to see this downward spiral in terms of the enrollment levels in our public schools as well. So,
on the macro level, programs like the Enterprise Fund, Vermont Employment Growth Incentive, a lot of taxpayer money going into these programs. Some scrutiny about the lack of accountability for these programs. Are you comfortable with the return on investment we've been getting from some of these programs?
You know, I know that the auditor is going to continue to look at the success of the Veggie program long term. And I applaud that. We always want a very careful analysis of, are we getting what we say we're getting? Now, locally, I'm thrilled that GS Precision has expanded. I'm thrilled that they did not move across the border into New Hampshire. Now, of course, as we know, the devil's in the details. And as we go back and look at the Enterprise Fund, and we made changes actually to the Enterprise Fund in terms of who sits on that committee, who is able to be in the room when those discussions are happening. There's now more oversight. And so I think that should always be our goal in state government, is having more oversight, not less oversight. What I think gets lost in the discussion sometimes about the Enterprise Fund and the Veggie program moving forward is we have a sense that, and I hear it a lot in the legislature, that if we support companies to stay here, to expand here, that it's corporate welfare. And I hear this term, Now, and I understand where it's coming from. I'm a Democrat. I understand, why people would use that kind of language. But what I need people to understand is we have workers right here in Windham County working at those places that want to see those jobs stay here. And I applaud the auditor for saying, let's make sure we're getting our money's worth. But I don't want to see us as a state turn and pivot away from thanking these companies for doing business in Vermont. Because if you look at our numbers in terms of workforce going forward, it's a difficult decision for an employer to make to stay in Vermont right now, because if you look at the demographics alone, we have in general, compared to other states, we do have a highly educated workforce, in terms of our productivity numbers. When you look regionally, excellent. That's why they stay. But if we pass the tipping point of them being able to find the workers that they need, then we are going to start seeing companies migrate away. And so I absolutely believe in oversight. I don't feel like veggie should have been the whipping boy that it's been for the last biennium. That's because I've been in those conversations in the room and feeling like when folks from the Agency of Commerce come in and explain to us, what the numbers mean, I do feel like we're being doing our due diligence to make sure that the taxpayer money is being used wisely. So, yeah.
Related to the economy is the issue of renewable energy on a number of different levels. Obviously,
Absolutely.
where we get our energy, but also you talk about these companies, especially here in Windham County right now, where we have a couple of very controversial wind projects that are being talked about. And part of it, I think, is because it's an outside developer coming in here. So thinking about that renewable energy siting legislation that was completed at the last of the session, special session, having to go up and fix it after the governor's veto, are you happy with the compromise that was struck on local control and the Public Service Board and how these things get cited?
I'm happier. I mean, I think that it's difficult, and I said this when I spoke in Grafton this summer. I was up at a forum there, which is that I wear the hat of the senator, and I also wear the hat of just a citizen who lives in Windham County. And when I go and I meet with voters in Grafton and Windham, I know that there is tremendous worry about how it will impact their way of life in Windham and Grafton. And you've got a town, you've got Windham that's pretty unified against the development of these wind towers, these wind turbines, and Grafton that has been, at least up until now, pretty divided. So like a lot of people in the state, I'm curious to see how that vote will go. As I've said to folks, I think it's very difficult to give towns unilateral power to decide not
the
to
veto.
have the veto power. And because we are part of something much larger than ourselves in terms of the energy grid. Okay, and I've lived in the shadow of 2 different nuclear power plants growing up, and so I understood that every time I turned on my cell phone, well, when I was younger, obviously we didn't have cell phones. Every time I turned on my television, that we are drawing power from the grid, and so I don't want to get too much into the conversation now about Iberdrola because we could talk for a very long time about it, but I do want people to understand that we are part of a grid outside of Vermont. We draw power, from that grid. We have been, through our nuclear power plant that has closed down, and through Indian Point that I lived in the shadow of growing up, that there are costs. There are always costs, personal costs, to any kind of power generation.
So you think wind does have a role to play in the renewable energy portfolio for the state?
I do, at least at this point. And so it's interesting. I just talked with one of my colleagues from Bennington County, Senator Campion. We were on the phone yesterday, and I asked him if he had gone up to visit the wind turbines in Lowell. And I asked him who had arranged that so that he could go and visit. And I'm interested in doing that because I think there's a lot that gets said in public forums because people feel so passionately on both sides. And I would like to be literally standing there in the shadow of these turbines and know, what does it feel like? What does it sound like? And I I'm still not at the point where I feel like I could give, so I could be part of a process that gave towns clear veto power over energy generation, veto power over those programs, because I don't think we would see also the amazing, solar boom that we've had here in Vermont. And so it's not a clear-cut issue for me.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
Sure.
Yeah.
Another difficult issue, and one that maybe like healthcare, you're a little tired of hearing from your constituents about school unification, the district unification, Act 46. It doesn't seem like anybody's happy with it, no matter what political stripe you are. It's just really a matter of tweak or overhaul.
Yeah.
So take me on that continuum where you sit.
Well, I want to back up just a minute, because I went back and looked at the most recent Castleton polls around Act 46, because I wanted to see, is there a breakdown by age? I was very curious. And there is a breakdown by age. So if you're over 65, you're about 65% in support of some kind of district consolidation. If you're between 45 and 65, again, clear majority, I think it was around 61. And then if you are 45 or under, so that group that tends to have the kids in the school, still a slight majority from that poll in support of some kind of unification. But you see the numbers in the poll dwindling as people are more engaged directly in their school system. And so I thought that was interesting, because as a politician, we hear a lot from voters around the county who no longer have kids in school, and they feel a different kind of tax pressure because many of them are on fixed incomes. Okay, so that plays into it.
Sure.
Right, and that impacts how they view the issue. Now, I was a teacher in 3 different small schools in Windham County before I left teaching and pursued politics.
And a family.
And absolutely, well, yeah, that's, whew, yeah. And what is hard for me is, and it happened at a forum I was at the other night, is that those of us who did vote in support of it were accused of having ulterior motives. Now, my kids are in the schools. I'm so committed to public schools. I feel one of the strongest ways in which we can strengthen our democracy and our civic engagement and our caring of other people in our communities is through our public schools. And I looked around the state and I saw that small schools are already closing. This is concerning to me. I do not want there to be towns that don't have viable small schools, or viable schools, period, small or otherwise. And so for me, 46 was an opportunity for flexibility for schools to collaborate to keep them open. That was always my intention. And I can speak for Senator White. She and I talked about it repeatedly. It was never our intention to try to close these small schools. So I just want to make that clear to voters. I taught in Guilford, and through my experience there were a number of years when 7th and 8th graders and their parents would call for meetings with the school board and with the faculty to talk about, does it make sense for us to keep the 7th and 8th grade here? There are pros and cons on both sides. And always heated conversations. We always want the best for our children, period, right? And so it was interesting that after, that must have come up 3 times while I was affiliated with Guilford. And then some years later, they did decide that they wanted to send the kids to the area middle school in Brattleboro so that they could have access to more music, more sports, other clubs, whatever it might be. Now, what I saw Act 46 is doing is sort of taking that microcosm of what I thought about. Here are these parents and these kids that feel like they want other opportunities, and empower the schools to have those conversations and enter into agreements that will enable them to have more programs, that will keep the kids in public school, that will keep them committed to keeping their school open. Now, I understand that the agency has interpreted the bill in a way that many of us did not intend. And so as I was thinking about coming here, I wanted to make sure I I highlighted the fact that Senator Polina, Senator Cummings, Janet Ansel, who is the finance chair on the House side, they wrote the letter to the Agency of Education saying, you've made some interpretations of the law that were not the intent of the law. And so I am eager to get back into, I don't know if I will be on the education committee or not. All our committees are up for reassignment. But I do know that there is a feeling that how do we make it more clear in the law so that there's more flexibility? One of the things that we wanted to make sure that there were clear off-ramps for schools. Marlboro is another town in our district who is having a difficult time trying to figure out who they could partner with. We wanted to make it clear that for some, the quote-unquote preferred structure is not going to work for them. And that was okay. And that was what we intended, which is why both your senators here in Windham County voted in support of it, because we felt there were off-ramps. And so, there's nothing like how we feel about our kids. Nothing. Yeah. And we feel it so deeply. And so I guess what I would want people to know is the conversation is continuing to happen, and we want to make sure that we're making decisions that will keep our public schools viable going forward. Which reminds me of something that I read recently, which is that this incoming class at UVM, smallest number of Vermonters, 20% of the incoming class at UVM are Vermonters. Okay, so we're now at a fifth of the incoming class. 20 years ago, a third of the incoming class were Vermonters. So I was looking back at some notes that I had taken. Senator White and I met with Tom Sullivan from UVM to sort of talk about this trend. And one of the things he said was, yeah, we have declining enrollment. We all know this. He said, but the other thing is when you compare some of the Vermont graduates with the out-of-state graduates are more prepared for the rigor of UVM. Yeah. And so the percentage, not only has the percentage applying decreased, the percentage of that body has decreased because the out-of-state applicants in many instances are more qualified. So that, again, looking long-term at how do we keep our public schools viable long-term, we want to make sure that our students are prepared to attend our flagship university.
Yeah, so. It all comes back again to growing the economy
Absolutely.
Over a long-term period of time. Always appreciate these conversations with you, Senator. I wanted to give you a chance before we go to address the voters out there directly.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I would really want people to know first and foremost is that I am so grateful to the voters of this county, because when I ran 2 years ago, a lot of people didn't know who I was, and they took a chance on me. And it has been so satisfying for me to meet with people who did not vote for me the first time around and say to me, thank you for the work that you've done. I appreciate that you have proved yourself on these particular issues that I care about, and I will be voting for you next time around. I am absolutely honored every time I walk into the State House and know that I'm one of only 30 people in the state of Vermont that get to represent Vermonters in the Senate. So thank you.
Yeah. Senator Becca Balint, good
Thank
luck
you,
in the
Chris.
election. And thank you at home for watching this edition of Meet the Candidates on Brattleboro Community Television. All the episodes are available online at brattleboro.tv.org. Also want to remind you all that voting day is November 8th. It's coming up. It will be taking place here in Brattleboro at the VFW, but you don't have to wait until November 8th. You can vote early. Go to your town clerk's office and get a ballot. Thank you.